My wife's dad despised me and disallowed our marriage. Years later, someone made him regret it. This is the story of how my life was turned upside down in a single night. And you won't believe who was behind it. When I learned that the person I trusted most was betraying me all along, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let it break me. I was going to fight back. Stay with me, because what happened next will leave you speechless. As I stood there on the sidewalk, staring up at the towering estate, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The Vance mansion loomed over me, its grandeur a constant reminder that I didn't belong in their world. The air was brisk, and the faint smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the aroma of wood smoke from the nearby chimneys. I adjusted my tie, the silk feeling foreign against my calloused fingers, and took a deep breath. Tonight was supposed to be a turning point, a moment I'd imagined countless times in my head. I'd worked so hard to get here, to prove that I wasn't just some kid from a broken neighborhood. Celine always said she didn't care about where I came from, that it didn't matter. But her father? That was another story entirely. Roderick Vance didn't just look down on me, he despised me. From the very first meeting, his icy stare had been a challenge, a dare to even consider myself worthy of his daughter's time. And now, here I was, standing outside his castle like home, ready to confront him in the only way I knew how, by asking Celine to marry me. I gripped the small velvet box in my pocket, feeling the smooth edges of the ring I'd picked out weeks ago. Every detail of this night had been carefully planned. I'd run the lines over and over again in my head, rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd stand, the look I hoped to see in Celine's eyes when I dropped to one knee. But standing there now, the weight of the moment pressed down on me. This wasn't just about love. It was about proving that I was good enough, that no amount of wealth or privilege could make me less deserving of the happiness I wanted with Celine. I told myself to breathe, to focus, to remember why I was doing this. I wasn't here to convince Roderick Vance of my worth. I was here because of her. The gravel crunched under my feet as I made my way to the door, each step heavier than the last. I'd worn my best suit, the one I saved for client meetings at the law firm, but it still felt out of place against the marble steps and polished brass fixtures. I rang the doorbell, the sound echoing through the massive front hall. After a moment, the door opened, and a butler I'd only met once before nodded silently, gesturing for me to come inside. The warmth of the mansion enveloped me, a stark contrast to the cold wind outside. The hallway stretched on, lined with portraits of the Vance family that seemed to judge me as I walked past. Their gazes, frozen in oil and gilt frames, felt more piercing than any words Roderick had ever spoken to me. I kept my shoulders straight, my chin high. Tonight wasn't about them. It was about Celine. I found her in the living room, perched on the edge of a sleek leather sofa. Her dress shimmered in the soft glow of the crystal chandelier above, and for a moment, the sight of her calmed the storm of doubt in my mind. Celine had always been my anchor, the one person who made me believe I could be more than the sum of my past. But tonight, something was different. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something distant, something I didn't want to name. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, Roderick appeared, stepping into the room like a king returning to his throne. He didn't need to say a word. The smirk on his face said it all. I wasn't welcome here. The silence was deafening. I cleared my throat, my palms damp despite the cool temperature of the room. "Celine," I began, forcing my voice to steady, "I love you. You know that. And I know I don't have the wealth or the legacy your father might want, but I've spent my life working hard to build a future. A future with you." I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the ring box, but before I could pull it out, Roderick's sharp laugh cut through the air. "You think you can offer her a life?" He scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "What do you have, Leander? A law firm job? A high school diploma? You think that's enough?" He leaned back in his chair, his confidence radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "Celine deserves someone who can give her everything you'll never have." My fists clenched at my sides, and I fought the urge to say something, to defend myself. But Celine's silence was louder than any words Roderick could have thrown at me. She sat there, hands clasped, looking down at the floor. She didn't argue. She didn't stand up for me. She just let him speak, let him tear me down, as if it was all true. My chest tightened, and the room seemed to close in around me. Every ounce of courage I'd mustered to walk through that door was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that spread through my ribs and into my gut. I straightened my back, the ring box still hidden in my pocket. I wasn't going to let Roderick Vance reduce me to nothing. I wasn't going to let him see me break. Without another word, I turned and walked out. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I welcomed it. I welcomed the sharpness, the clarity it brought. As I stood outside, the mansion towering behind me, I realized that tonight wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Roderick might have won this battle, but I wasn't done. Not yet. I didn't even realize how hard I was gripping the steering wheel, until I pulled into the driveway of that estate. Again, the rubber pressing into my palms like I was holding on for dear life. I sat there for a moment, staring at the golden light spilling through the towering windows, my chest tight with the weight of what I was about to do. This time, I wasn't here to propose. There would be no velvet box in my pocket, no carefully rehearsed words. This time, it was Celine who had called me. She'd said she needed to talk urgently, and against every ounce of logic, I'd agreed. I told myself I was doing it for closure. I told myself I just wanted to hear her out. But the truth was, a part of me still held on to the hope that there was something left to save. That maybe she'd found the courage she couldn't muster that night. That maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stand up to her father. I cut the engine, the silence inside the car amplifying the steady drumbeat of my pulse. A cold breeze swept across the front lawn, and as I stepped out, I tugged my jacket tighter around me. The stars above were obscured by the city's glow, leaving the sky a dull orange haze. The mansion's front door opened before I even reached the top step, and the butler, what was his name again? Edward? Edwin, stepped aside without a word. His expression was as neutral as ever, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Pity? I shook off the thought as I crossed the threshold. The house was just as I remembered it, though it felt colder now, more imposing. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's light, the portraits on the walls stared down with the same haughty disapproval, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old money. I followed the butler down the hall, my footsteps echoing loudly. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the mansion itself was trying to crush me under its weight. I knew Roderick was home. His car had been in the driveway. I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation, for his cutting remarks, his condescending tone. But for now, it was just me and the butler in that long, silent corridor. When we reached the living room, I saw Celine standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the streetlights outside. She turned as I entered, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Leander," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. My eyes flicked to the chair across from her, the same chair Roderick had lounged in last time, his steely gaze piercing me like a dagger. It was empty now, but the memory of that night was as vivid as ever. I could still hear his mocking laugh, still feel the sting of his words. A lump rose in my throat, and I forced it down, focusing on Celine instead. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I wasn't here to make small talk. I needed to know why she'd called me, what she wanted. I needed to understand why she hadn't spoken up that night, why she'd let her father's disdain crush me without so much as a word of protest. Celine shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasping and unclasping in front of her. She looked down, her long dark hair falling forward to hide her face. For a moment, I thought she might not answer. But then she looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and I saw something I hadn't seen that night: guilt. "I couldn't do it," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I wanted to, Leander. I wanted to stand up to him, to tell him that I didn't care about his approval, that I loved you. But I froze. I saw the way he looked at you, the way he looked at me, and I couldn't." Her voice cracked, and she turned back to the window, her reflection in the glass a ghostly twin of the woman I'd once thought I knew. I took a step closer, my arms crossing tightly over my chest. "You couldn't. Or you wouldn't." I shot back, my words harsher than I intended, but I couldn't stop them. "Do you have any idea what it felt like, standing there while he tore me apart, and you just sat there? You didn't say a word, Celine. Not one word." My voice rose, the anger I'd tried so hard to bury clawing its way to the surface. "You let him humiliate me, And you did nothing. You want me to believe that you love me, but you couldn't even defend me. How am I supposed to trust you after that? Celine spun around, tears glistening in her eyes. I made a mistake, Leander. I know that. But don't you dare stand there and act like you're the only one who was hurt that night. I was terrified, okay? Terrified of losing you, terrified of losing my family. I didn't know what to do, and I froze. I can't change that now, but I'm trying to make it right. That's why I called you here, because I want to fix this. I want us to be us again. Her words hit me like a gut punch. She was right. I wasn't the only one who'd been hurt. But that didn't make it any easier to forget what had happened, to erase the memory of her silence, her inaction. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling sharply. I don't know if we can go back, Celine. I don't know if I can ever look at you and not see that night. Not hear his voice, not feel the way I felt when you let him win. I'm not asking you to forget, she said, stepping closer, her voice softer now. I'm asking you to give me a chance to show you that I'm not that person anymore. I know I have to earn your trust back, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I just need to know if you're willing to let me try. Her words hung in the air, and I felt myself wavering. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she could stand up to him, that she could choose me. But the scars from that night ran deep, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to let them heal. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. My body tensed, and I turned to see Roderick entering the room, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. He glanced at Celine, then at me, and a slow, humorless smile spread across his face. Leander, he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. I see you're still trying to play house. How quaint. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. He crossed the room, pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. Celine, you do realize this. Arrangement is beneath you, don't you? A man like him, he gestured toward me with his glass, can't give you the life you deserve. Why settle for mediocrity when you can have the best? Celine stiffened, her hands clenching at her sides. Stop it, Dad, she said, her voice firm. It was the first time I'd ever heard her stand up to him, and it caught me off guard. Roderick turned to her, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Excuse me? I said stop, Celine repeated, her voice steady now. Leander may not have your money or your connections, but he's twice the man you'll ever be. You've made it clear how you feel, but this is my life, not yours. I stared at her, stunned. For the first time, she was standing her ground, and it was like seeing a completely different person. Roderick's smile faltered, replaced by a cold, hard glare. You'll regret this, Celine, he said quietly, his tone laced with menace. Mark my words. He turned on his heel and left the room, his footsteps fading down the hall. Celine turned to me, her face pale but determined. I'm sorry, she said softly. I should have done that a long time ago. I didn't know what to say. The anger, the hurt, the frustration, they were all still there. But for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe we could still find a way back to each other. I looked into her eyes and took a deep breath, my heart pounding. It's a start, I said, my voice low. But it's going to take more than that. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, everything took a shocking turn. Could I still outsmart them? Or was it too late? Comment 1 if you think I'll get my revenge. Or 2 if you think I'll lose everything. I'd always known life wouldn't hand me anything on a silver platter. Every inch of ground I'd gained, every opportunity I'd seized, I'd fought for tooth and nail. But as I walked into the office that morning, it felt like I was about to climb a mountain with no summit in sight. The Vance family's shadow still loomed over me, a constant reminder of how far I was from truly escaping their grasp. I shook off the weight of their disapproval as best I could, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand, building my career, proving I belonged, even if it wasn't for them, even if it was only for me. The elevator ride to my floor was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own doubts a little too clearly. By the time the doors opened, I'd managed to push those thoughts back into the corners of my mind. I walked into my office at Hawthorne and Wright, and let the familiar rhythm of the workday take over. My desk was already piled high with files, each one representing another step closer to where I wanted to be. The hum of phones ringing, The muffled voices of colleagues discussing cases. This was my battlefield now. And I was determined to win. I'd started at the firm as little more than a glorified clerk, the kind of position people barely notice. I fetched coffee, filed paperwork, and spent my nights poring over legal texts, trying to absorb every piece of knowledge I could. But I didn't stay in the shadows for long. I put in the hours, took on the tasks no one else wanted, and slowly began to prove myself. Benedict Hawthorne, one of the firm's senior partners, had taken notice. At first, I thought it was just a passing nod of approval, but over time, he began to pull me into more significant cases, letting me see the inner workings of the legal machine. Benedict wasn't a man who offered compliments freely, and when he did, they were as sharp as they were rare. "You've got potential," he told me once, leaning back in his chair, his piercing gaze studying me like a chess piece. "But potential means nothing if you don't use it. Don't just follow the rules. Learn how to bend them without breaking them. That's how you win in this business." His words stuck with me, not just because they were true, but because I knew he was right. In a world where the powerful had every advantage, knowing how to maneuver through the gray areas wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. I threw myself into the work with everything I had. I started coming in early, staying late, and volunteering for cases that seemed impossible. My reputation within the firm began to shift. I was no longer just the new guy trying to prove himself. I was someone people relied on when the stakes were high. When a major client's acquisition deal was about to fall apart, I was the one who found the loophole that saved it. When a high-profile lawsuit threatened to tarnish the firm's record, I was the one who uncovered the evidence that turned the case around. Each victory felt like a small, defiant shout into the void that the Vance family had left in me. "You see?" I wanted to scream. "I'm not who you think I am." Of course, the work didn't come without its challenges. The pressure was relentless. The higher I climbed, the more people expected from me, and the margin for error shrank to almost nothing. I had to be better, faster, sharper than anyone else in the room. Late nights turned into early mornings, and the hours I spent at the firm far outnumbered the hours I spent anywhere else. Friends started to fade into acquaintances, and social calls became brief texts saying, "I'm swamped, maybe next week." It was lonely, but I convinced myself it was worth it. Every time I signed off on a deal, every time I won a case, it was another step forward. Another reason to believe I could leave the shadow of the Vances behind for good. What I hadn't anticipated was how much of a toll it would take on me personally. There were nights when I'd sit alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights through my window, wondering if I was even doing this for the right reasons. Sure, I was building a name for myself, but at what cost? The weight of what I'd given up: relationships, free time, even sleep was starting to catch up with me. And yet, every time I thought about slowing down, about easing up just a little, the memory of Roderick's smug grin would surface. The way he'd dismissed me so easily, like I was nothing. The way Celine had stayed silent, her gaze lowered, as though she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. That memory pushed me to keep going. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let their doubts define me. As the months turned into years, I found myself handling cases that would have been unthinkable when I first started. I wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore. I was a player in the game. I had clients who trusted me to handle their most sensitive legal matters, and partners who looked to me when the pressure was on. But the higher I climbed, the more I realized that the fight was never really over. Every victory came with a new challenge. Every success brought a new set of expectations. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. I thrived on the adrenaline, on the knowledge that I was proving every single person who doubted me wrong. Benedict remained a constant presence, though his mentoring became more of a distant guidance as I grew more confident in my abilities. He didn't hand out praise often, but when he did, it was like gold. "You're getting there," he told me after I won a particularly complex case. "But don't let it get to your head. The moment you think you've arrived is the moment you start to fall." I took his words to heart. I knew better than to rest on my laurels. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let anything slip now. And then, just as I thought I was finding my footing, the first whispers of something bigger began to surface. A case crossed my desk, one that seemed routine at first glance. A dispute over a contract, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I dug deeper, I started to see patterns, transactions that didn't add up. shell companies that led nowhere, and names that appeared in places they shouldn't. The deeper I went, the more I realized that I wasn't just looking at a single contract dispute. I was looking at something that could unravel an entire empire. And at the center of it all, like a spider in its web, was Roderick Vance. The realization hit me like a freight train. The man who had tried to break me, who had dismissed me as nothing more than a nuisance, was at the heart of something far darker than I'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about proving myself anymore. It was about exposing the truth. It was about standing up to the very system that had kept people like me in the shadows for so long. As I sat there in my office, staring at the papers spread out before me, I felt a familiar determination rise within me. This was my chance. This was my moment. I wasn't just going to climb the mountain. I was going to tear it down. I'd gone over the documents so many times that the numbers felt like they'd been burned into the back of my eyelids. No matter how often I checked, no matter which way I turned them, they all told the same story. Roderick Vance wasn't just a titan of industry. He was a titan of deception. The more I pieced together, the more the entire foundation of his empire looked like it was built on sand. Shady offshore accounts. Shell corporations that existed only on paper. Deals made in the dead of night, and buried so deep you'd need a map to find them. But I'd found them, and now they were all I could think about. Every day after work, I'd drive back to my apartment, sit at my small, battered desk, and spread the papers out under the dim light of a second-hand desk lamp. The glow of the city lights spilled in through the window, blending with the faint hum of traffic below. It was a reminder of the world outside, a world that seemed so distant from the tangled mess I was unraveling. I'd thought climbing the ranks at Hawthorne and Wright was hard. But this was a different kind of battle. It wasn't just me against a challenging case or a stubborn client. It was me against a man who held more power than I could even comprehend. Roderick didn't just win battles, he ended them before they started. And I was the fool who thought I could fight back. I kept telling myself that I wasn't doing this for revenge. This wasn't about that night at the Vance mansion, the humiliation I'd felt under Roderick's withering gaze, or even Celine's silence. No, I told myself this was about something bigger. It was about justice, about righting a wrong. But in the dark hours of the night, as I sifted through the evidence, I couldn't help but feel that it was personal. I wanted to see Roderick fall, not just because he deserved it, but because I needed it. I needed to prove that I wasn't the man he thought I was. That I wasn't someone he could dismiss with a wave of his hand. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous it felt. Roderick's reach extended far beyond the boardrooms and golf courses of the elite. He had people, lawyers, politicians, even law enforcement who owed him favors, who looked the other way when things didn't add up. It was a machine, perfectly oiled, and nearly impossible to break. But I'd found a crack, and once I saw it, I couldn't look away. That's what kept me up at night, what kept me pushing forward even when every instinct screamed that I should walk away. That tiny, almost imperceptible weakness. If I could exploit it, if I could pull it apart piece by piece, maybe, just maybe, I could bring the whole thing crashing down. It wasn't just the documents, either. The more I uncovered, the more people I found who had been hurt by Roderick's schemes. Small business owners who'd been run out of town. Families who'd lost everything after being on the wrong side of a deal. Employees who had dedicated their lives to his companies, only to be cast aside when they were no longer useful. Their stories weighed on me, added fuel to the fire that was already burning in my chest. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for them, for the people who couldn't fight back. It was a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but one I couldn't ignore. But there was always that nagging voice in the back of my head, whispering that I was in over my head. What if I couldn't do it? What if I failed? I'd spent my life clawing my way out of the shadows, and now I was willingly stepping into a fight with a man who could crush me with a single phone call. It didn't matter how much evidence I had or how solid my case was. All it would take was one wrong move, one misstep, and I'd be finished. My career, my reputation, everything I'd built, it would all be gone. And yet, I couldn't stop. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving that I could stand on my own 2 feet. That I could face down someone like Roderick and walk away with my head held high. I started keeping my findings in a small safe I'd bought from a discount store, hidden in the corner of my closet. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a cheap detective novel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Every time I left my apartment, I'd glance over my shoulder. Every time I unlocked my office, I'd check the doorframe for scratches, as if someone might have been inside. Paranoia was becoming my constant companion, but I couldn't afford to ignore it. Not when the stakes were this high. Not when I was going up against a man who had built his entire life on eliminating threats before they could get close. Celine crossed my mind more often than I wanted to admit. She was still in the picture, still tied to her father's world, and I couldn't help but wonder what she knew. Did she have any idea what I was uncovering? Would she even care if she did? I told myself it didn't matter, that I couldn't let her distract me. But late at night, when the city was quiet, and the only sound was the occasional car passing below, her face would appear in my mind. The way she'd looked at me that night at the mansion, the way her voice had trembled when she finally stood up to her father. Was it all an act? Or was there still a part of her that cared about me, about us? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I used it as fuel. Every question, every doubt, every memory, I channeled them into my work. I knew I couldn't win this fight by playing fair. Roderick didn't play fair, and neither could I. I needed to think ahead, to anticipate his moves before he made them. I spent hours crafting strategies, considering every possible outcome, every counter-move he might make. It was exhausting, but it was the only way I stood a chance. The first time I passed a piece of information to a reporter, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I'd been careful anonymous emails, encrypted messages, but it still felt like stepping onto a tightrope without a safety net. If Roderick found out what I was doing, I'd be done. But as I hit send, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I was finally doing something. I wasn't just sitting back, letting him win. I was taking a stand, no matter how small it seemed. The next morning, I woke up to a headline that made my heart race. Insider documents suggest financial misconduct at Vance Corporation. It was just the beginning, but it was a crack in the armor. Roderick's name was in the news, not for his successes, but for his alleged crimes. I knew it wouldn't be enough to bring him down, not yet, but it was a start. And as I sat there, staring at the screen, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I had no idea how quickly the situation would spiral once the first story broke. It was almost as if the moment those initial headlines went live, a firestorm erupted. Reporters began calling every known associate of Roderick Vance, digging up anything they could find, chasing rumors, whispers, and fragments of truth. The pressure wasn't just mounting for Roderick, it was closing in on me, too. Every step I took felt like I was walking a tightrope. I'd built my case carefully, stacking each piece of evidence like a fragile tower, and I knew if even one detail didn't hold, the whole thing could collapse. But the more attention the story got, the more I realized I'd underestimated just how deep this rabbit hole went. It started with the financial misconduct allegations. That alone was enough to make waves, but as the days wore on, the leaks seemed to take on a life of their own. New documents surfaced that even I hadn't seen, revealing a web of deceit that stretched far beyond what I had uncovered. Suddenly, there were questions about insider trading, bribery, and offshore accounts tied to shell companies that had operated for decades. Roderick's empire wasn't just teetering on the edge, it was starting to crumble, brick by brick. And yet, instead of feeling vindicated, I felt like the walls were closing in on me. The deeper I went, the more I realized I was in uncharted territory. I wasn't just exposing a fraud, I was stepping into a world of powerful enemies I hadn't even known existed. Every morning, I woke up wondering if today was the day someone would knock on my door. The thought of Roderick's people finding out that I was behind the leaks kept me awake at night. I'd worked hard to cover my tracks, using burner phones and encrypted accounts, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. The simplest noises, a car engine outside, a knock on the neighbor's door, set my nerves on edge. I started second-guessing everything, wondering if I'd missed something in my attempts to stay anonymous. At work, I kept my head down, pretending I was focused on the firm's usual cases. But in the back of my mind, I was constantly thinking about the growing scandal. My colleagues seemed oblivious, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. What made it worse was the phone calls. They started off vague, from numbers I didn't recognize. A voice on the other end would ask if I'd seen the latest report, then hang up before I could respond. At first, I chalked it up to overzealous journalists, trying to sniff out the source of the leaks. But as the calls continued, they became more pointed. One night, I answered and heard a man's voice say, "You think you're clever, don't you?" before the line went dead. Another time, a text popped up on my phone, "This won't end well for you." I couldn't tell if it was someone bluffing or if they actually knew who I was. Either way, it was enough to keep me on edge. Despite the fear, I couldn't stop. The evidence I had was too damning, too important. If I backed down now, Roderick would spin the narrative, regain control, and bury everything. I couldn't let that happen. I reminded myself that this wasn't just about me. It was about all the people he'd hurt along the way, business partners he'd ruined, employees he'd discarded, communities he'd exploited. The more I thought about them, the more determined I became. If I had to put myself at risk to expose the truth, so be it. I'd rather go down fighting than live with the knowledge that I let him get away with it. One night, as I pored over yet another batch of documents, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A set of emails between Roderick and a high-ranking government official laid out a scheme. So brazen, I could hardly believe it. They'd rigged bids on major contracts, funneling money into offshore accounts while securing lucrative deals for Roderick's company. The kicker? Those deals had been approved at the expense of smaller firms, some of which were forced into bankruptcy as a result. The people affected weren't just faceless entities, they were families who'd lost everything. That realization hit me hard. This wasn't just a white-collar crime. This was personal. It was lives destroyed, futures erased. And Roderick had done it all with a smirk on his face and the confidence that no one would ever catch him. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything else. I went through my workday on autopilot, nodding along in meetings, signing documents, and pretending like my mind wasn't racing a mile a minute. When I finally made it home, I sat at my desk and stared at the emails again. I knew what I had to do. These weren't just skeletons in Roderick's closet, they were the smoking gun. If I released them, it would be the final nail in his coffin. But it would also put me in even more danger. The stakes had never been higher, and the weight of the decision pressed down on me like 1,000 pounds. I couldn't make this choice lightly. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining what would happen once the emails went public. Would Roderick come after me directly? Would someone knock on my door, drag me out into the night, and make me disappear? The fear was suffocating, but so was the idea of letting him get away with it. By morning, I made my decision. I would release the emails. I'd find a way to do it safely, to ensure they reached the right people. It was the only way to keep the momentum going, to ensure that Roderick's empire couldn't recover. I set the plan in motion that afternoon. I sent the emails to a trusted reporter, someone who'd been covering the story from the beginning. I made sure to use a secure channel, taking every precaution I could. Once they were sent, all I could do was wait. I felt like I was holding my breath for the rest of the day, checking the news every few minutes, waiting for the next headline to drop. When it finally did, the reaction was immediate. The media frenzy that followed was like nothing I'd ever seen. News anchors speculated about the fallout, experts debated what it would mean for the industry, and Roderick's legal team scrambled to contain the damage. But I couldn't celebrate. The risk was still very real. The emails had blown the case wide open, but now more people would be looking for the source. I knew I had to be even more careful than before. I'd kicked the hornet's nest, and the swarm was coming. All I could do was keep moving forward, hoping that I could stay one step ahead, that I could outmaneuver the powerful forces trying to shut me down. I didn't have a choice anymore. I was in too deep. It was the kind of silence that weighed heavy. The kind that made every sound my own breathing, the soft creak of the chair beneath me, feel like thunder. I'd been sitting there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, waiting. The emails had been sent, the evidence handed off, and now all I could do was wait for the fallout. But the waiting was worse than the action itself. Each passing minute felt like a countdown to something I couldn't see. I leaned back, rubbed my temples, and tried to convince myself that I hadn't just made the biggest mistake of my life. That nagging voice in the back of my head whispered that I'd gone too far, that I'd underestimated Roderick and the people he kept in his orbit. I told myself I didn't care, that this was the only way. But the truth was, I didn't know what would happen next. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The city outside my window looked peaceful, almost serene. Streetlights glowed softly, and the faint hum of distant traffic reminded me that life was still moving, that people were still going about their business. But for me, the world had come to a standstill. My apartment, once a refuge after long days at the office, felt like a cage now. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. Even the familiar clutter of files and legal pads on my desk seemed to mock me. They were a reminder of the normal life I'd been trying to build, a life that, if I wasn't careful, would disappear as quickly as it had started. I tried to distract myself by going over the documents again, checking the details one more time. The numbers still lined up. The emails still painted a clear picture of corruption, fraud, and greed. But no matter how solid the evidence was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on a cliff's edge. The fear wasn't just about being discovered, as the whistleblower, it was about what came next. I'd always thought the hardest part would be gathering the evidence, exposing the truth. I hadn't considered what would happen after. How far would Roderick go to protect himself? How much would the people in his pocket be willing to do to keep his empire intact? The knock at the door nearly made me jump out of my skin. My pulse quickened as I stood, my mind racing through possibilities. I hadn't invited anyone over, hadn't even told anyone what I was doing. Was this it? Had someone already figured it out? I walked to the door as quietly as I could, every step feeling like I was walking into a trap. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated, then opened it a crack. It was my neighbor, an older man who lived down the hall. He held up a piece of mail that had accidentally been delivered to his unit. I took it from him with a smile that felt forced, thanked him, and closed the door. As I leaned against it, I realized my hands were trembling. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows, seeing threats where there were none. But how could I not? I was up against one of the most powerful men I'd ever known, someone who had resources and influence I couldn't even begin to measure. I tried to tell myself that the truth would win out, that justice would prevail, but the doubts were getting harder to ignore. I sat back down and glanced at my phone. No calls, no messages. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The silence was too loud. I checked the news again, refreshing the page, waiting for any sign that the story was gaining traction. When it finally did, the headline sent a shiver down my spine. Explosive documents reveal decades of financial misconduct at Vance Corporation. I read the article twice, then a third time, my chest tightening with each word. It was out there now, Roderick's name, his company, the details of his corruption. There was no taking it back, no hiding. But instead of feeling vindicated, I felt exposed. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, the only light coming from the city outside. I thought about everything that had led to this moment, every decision, every compromise, every step forward that had felt more like a stumble. I thought about Celine, about that night at the mansion, and the look on her face when her father humiliated me. I'd convinced myself that I was doing this for more than revenge, that it was about justice. And maybe it was. But I couldn't deny that I wanted to see him fall, wanted to watch his carefully constructed world collapse under the weight of his lies. I wanted to prove to myself, to everyone, that I wasn't the man he thought I was, that I was better than him. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that never seemed to sleep. Somewhere out there, Roderick was reading the same headline I had. I wondered what he was thinking, what his next move would be. I knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. Men like him never did. They doubled down, called in favors, used every tool at their disposal to bury the truth. And I knew that if he suspected I was behind this, he'd come for me. The question wasn't if, it was when. I clenched my fists and forced myself to breathe. This was the fight I'd chosen, the line I'd crossed. There was no turning back now. I turned back to my desk, picked up a pen, and started writing notes for what came next. I couldn't afford to sit back and wait for the fallout. I had to be ready. I had to think several steps ahead, anticipate his moves before he made them. The battle wasn't over just because the first shots had been fired. It was only beginning. And as scared as I was, as uncertain as the future seemed, I felt a flicker of resolve. I had come this far. One wouldn't stop now. I couldn't. I would see this through, no matter what it cost. The sound of my phone buzzing on the desk startled me out of my thoughts. For hours, I'd been pacing around my apartment, trying to piece together what to do next. The initial headline had sparked a media frenzy. Reporters were digging deeper, more articles were surfacing, and it felt like the entire city was now watching Roderick's empire begin to unravel. But the call I'd just received wasn't from a journalist. It wasn't even from one of the few trusted contacts I had. It was from Benedict, and his tone was one I'd never heard from him before, tense, almost urgent. "Leander," he said, his voice low and clipped. "We need to meet. Now." I hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. "What's going on?" I asked, my own voice shaky with nerves. "Not over the phone," Benedict replied quickly. "Just meet me at my office. And come alone." I didn't like it. It was too sudden, too vague. But I knew better than to ignore him. Benedict had been my mentor since day one, guiding me through the trenches of the legal world, teaching me how to navigate its countless pitfalls. If he was telling me to come alone, it meant he had something serious to share, something that couldn't wait. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the cold night air, my mind racing as I walked the short distance to his office. The streets were quieter than usual, but I couldn't tell if it was because of the late hour, or because I was too wrapped up in my own thoughts to notice the usual city buzz. When I arrived, the building felt eerily empty. Benedict's office was at the end of the hall, and as I approached, I could see that the lights were still on inside. I knocked once, then twice, before the door opened slightly. Benedict's face appeared in the gap, his expression grim. Without a word, he stepped aside, letting me in. He closed the door behind me, and for a moment, we stood in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. "What's going on?" I asked again, my nerves getting the better of me. Benedict motioned for me to sit, but I couldn't. My legs were too restless, my body too wired. I stayed standing as he moved behind his desk, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. He looked older than I remembered, more worn, as if the weight of whatever he was about to say had been pressing down on him for years. "Leander," he began, his voice quieter now. "What you're doing, it's brave. I won't deny that. But it's also dangerous. You've poked a sleeping bear, and it's starting to wake up." I felt my stomach tighten. "What are you talking about?" "I've been getting calls," he said, "from people I haven't spoken to in years. They're not just asking about Roderick, they're asking about you. They're putting pieces together, Leander, and they don't like what they're seeing." I could feel the blood drain from my face. "What kind of people?" "The kind who don't want their business aired out in public," Benedict replied, his tone heavy. "The kind who can ruin a career, a life, with a single phone call." My mind raced, trying to process his words. I'd expected pushback from Roderick's camp, maybe some legal threats, maybe a smear campaign. But this was something else. Something darker. "What do they know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Benedict sighed and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "They know someone's been leaking information to the press. They know it's coming from inside our circles. And they're getting closer to figuring out that it's you." I couldn't breathe. All the precautions I'd taken, all the steps I'd followed to stay anonymous, they suddenly felt like a flimsy wall, one that was about to collapse under the weight of these unknown forces. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my tone more defensive than I intended. "Are you trying to warn me or scare me?" "Both," Benedict admitted. "I'm telling you because you need to understand what you're up against. Roderick isn't just some corporate big shot. He's tied into networks that reach higher than you can imagine. The more you expose, the more desperate they'll become. And desperate people do dangerous things." I paced the room, my mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. "I can't stop now," I said finally. "You know that. I've already come this far. If I back down now, it's all for nothing." "I'm not telling you to stop," Benedict said, his voice steady. "I'm telling you to be careful, to think about your next move before you make it. Because if you don't, they will. And they'll be ready for you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My thoughts were too loud, my emotions too raw. I stood there, staring out the window at the city below, trying to steady my breathing. Everything was happening too fast. The headlines, the calls, the sudden realization that I wasn't just taking on Roderick, I was taking on something much bigger. Something I didn't fully understand. Benedict broke the silence. "You're smart, Leander. You've always been smart. But don't let your pride blind you. Think carefully about who you trust, about who you share information with. and about what you're willing to sacrifice." His words hit me hard, but I nodded. I didn't know what else to do. I felt like I was standing on a tightrope over a chasm, and every step I took only made the rope thinner. I'd started this fight with a clear goal, a righteous purpose. But now, I wasn't sure if I was fighting for justice, or just trying to prove I wasn't afraid. Either way, I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close. As I left Benedict's office and stepped back into the cold night, the weight of his warning hung heavy in the air. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched lingered. I pulled my coat tighter around me and quickened my pace. I needed to get home, to regroup, to figure out what came next. I needed to be ready. Because Benedict was right about one thing. They were watching, and I had to stay one step ahead. It wasn't until I got home that it all began to sink in. Benedict's words rang in my ears, their weight heavier now that I was alone with my thoughts. He'd told me to be careful, to think about who I trusted. But who could I trust? He'd been my mentor, the man who taught me the ropes, who saw potential in me when no one else did. And now he was warning me to keep my guard up, to watch my back. That gnawed at me. If Benedict, the one person I had always counted on, sounded that shaken, what chance did I have of staying ahead of Roderick's machine? And just how deep did this rabbit hole go? I paced my apartment, the city lights outside painting faint shadows on the walls. The streets below were quiet, almost serene. But in my mind, I saw danger lurking in every dark corner. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was reality. Benedict wouldn't have called me in if it wasn't serious. And now, every move I made felt like it had a target on it. They were watching, closing in. I could feel it. Sitting down at my desk, I pulled out the documents I'd been using to build my case. Spreadsheets, emails, invoices. Each piece was a fragment of the bigger picture. These papers represented years of deception. The foundation of Roderick's empire. I'd spent months piecing it all together. Every late night, every dead-end lead, every shred of evidence I could find. And now that it was all out there, I felt more exposed than ever. I picked up one of the emails, the one that had started it all, and read it again. It was a simple exchange on the surface, just a routine communication between two mid-level executives. But if you knew where to look, if you connected the dots, it was damning. And I'd connected them. I'd laid the groundwork for the story that was now plastered across headlines, shaking the city to its core. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of pride. I'd done what I set out to do. I'd exposed the truth. But that flicker didn't last. It was quickly replaced by the cold realization that the more I revealed, the more I put myself in the crosshairs. My phone buzzed, and my heart jumped. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick it up. I pressed the green button, bringing the phone to my ear. "Hello? Mr. Hawk," the voice on the other end said, calm but unnervingly cold. "I believe we have a mutual acquaintance." The blood in my veins turned to ice. "Who is this?" "You've made quite a name for yourself," the voice continued, ignoring my question. "The articles, the leaks, it's impressive. But you should know, not everyone appreciates your dedication to the truth." "Is that a threat?" I said, my grip tightening on the phone. "Not a threat," the voice said smoothly. "Just a friendly reminder. You've stirred up quite a mess, and some people don't take kindly to having their business exposed." I didn't say anything. I just listened, my chest tightening with each passing second. The call ended abruptly, leaving me alone in the silence once more. I stared at the phone in my hand, my mind racing. Whoever that was, they weren't bluffing. They knew who I was, what I'd done, and they weren't going to let it go unanswered. The next few days passed in a blur. I barely left my apartment, glued to the news, watching as the story continued to unfold. More sources came forward, more damning evidence was revealed. The media frenzy was relentless. Roderick's name was dragged through the mud, his company's stock plummeting, his carefully curated image falling apart piece by piece. But with every new revelation, my unease grew. I wasn't just fighting a legal battle anymore, this was personal. And I knew that Roderick wouldn't just sit back and let me win. He'd come for me. It was only a matter of time. I spent every waking moment preparing for the inevitable. I went over my evidence again and again, looking for weak points, trying to anticipate what Roderick's team would do next. I couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Benedict's words stayed with me, a constant reminder that I had to think 3 steps ahead. But no matter how much I prepared, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was 1 step behind, that Roderick and his people were already moving pieces on the board that I couldn't see. When the knock came, it wasn't who I expected. It wasn't Roderick's lawyers or some hired thug. It was Celine. She stood in the hallway, looking unsure, almost hesitant. For a moment, I just stared at her, unable to speak. The last time we'd seen each other, everything had fallen apart. She'd stayed silent when her father tore me down. And now, after everything, here she was. I didn't know whether to let her in or close the door in her face. "I heard what's happening," she said, her voice quiet. "I need to talk to you." I opened the door wider, stepping aside to let her in. She walked past me, her gaze falling on the cluttered desk, the scattered papers. She picked up one of the documents and scanned it briefly, before setting it back down. "So it's true," she said. "You're the one who exposed him." I crossed my arms, watching her carefully. "What do you want, Celine?" She hesitated, meeting my eyes. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For not standing up for you. For not, save it." I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's a little late for apologies." Her face fell, and for a moment, I felt a twinge of guilt. But I couldn't let myself soften, not now. Not after everything I'd been through. "I know I messed up," she said. "But you have to understand my father. He controls everything. I didn't think I had a choice." "You always have a choice," I said, my voice cold. "You just didn't want to make it." She flinched, and I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. Her presence stirred up too many emotions: anger, regret, sadness. I couldn't afford to feel any of them right now. I had to stay focused. I had to stay strong. "I'm trying to make it right," she said. "I want to help." "Help?" I scoffed, spinning back to face her. "How could you possibly help now?" She hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag. "Because I know things," she said quietly. "Things you don't. Things that could help you." I stared at the paper in her hand, my mind racing. Could I trust her? Could I take her at her word after everything that had happened? Or was this just another way for Roderick to get to me? I didn't know, but I knew one thing: whatever choice I made, there was no going back. The stakes were higher than ever, and the game was far from over. It felt like the room was closing in around me, each passing second stretching out into eternity. I stared at Celine, her hand still clutching that piece of paper, her face a mixture of guilt and something I couldn't quite place: determination, maybe? I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that she was here to help me, to make things right. But I couldn't shake the memories of all the times she stayed silent, all the times she chose her father's approval over standing by me. Trusting her again felt impossible, and yet, here she was, offering something she claimed could help. I took a deep breath, my eyes narrowing as I finally spoke. "What's on that paper?" My voice was steady, but the edge of suspicion was unmistakable. I didn't move from where I stood, arms crossed, keeping a safe distance between us. Celine hesitated, then unfolded the paper slowly, as if revealing it would set off some kind of chain reaction she wasn't prepared for. "It's a list of names," she said quietly. "People who worked for my father. People who know more than they've let on. If you're going to bring him down completely, you need to talk to them." I took a step closer, my eyes scanning the names written in neat, deliberate handwriting. They weren't just employees, they were his inner circle. The ones who helped him keep everything running behind the scenes. These were the people I'd suspected existed, but could never confirm. If what Celine was saying was true, this list was the missing piece I'd been searching for. But why was she giving it to me now? "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Why not just go to the authorities yourself?" She looked away, her shoulders sagging. "Because I can't. Not yet. If I do, he'll know it came from me. And if he knows that..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. As much as I hated to admit it, Roderick still had power over her, whether through loyalty, fear, or something else, I couldn't tell. But it was enough to keep her from acting directly. That alone should have been enough reason for me to slam the door on her offer. Yet, deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. This list was what I needed. It was the chance to finally tip the scales, to force Roderick into a corner he couldn't escape. I took the paper from her hand, my fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. The tension was palpable, but I forced myself to focus. If I use this, he'll know someone inside gave it to me. You realize that, don't you? She nodded. I know, but he won't know it was me. Not if you're careful. Careful, I repeated under my breath. A bitter laugh escaped me. That's a lot to ask for, considering the mess I'm in. Celine's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, I thought she might leave. But then she straightened, her chin lifting ever so slightly. You don't have to trust me, she said, her voice steadier now. Just use the names. Do what you came here to do. And then, maybe, we can figure out the rest later. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned away, the list of names still clutched in my hand. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked to my desk and sat down. The papers scattered across its surface seemed to blur together as my mind raced. This list changed everything. It gave me leads, connections, a way to dig deeper into Roderick's operations. But it also made me a target more than I already was. I heard Celine move toward the door. I should go, she said, her voice softer now. But please, be careful. The door closed quietly behind her, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the names on the list, each one a potential ally or a potential risk. I knew what I had to do, but the weight of it pressed down on me. The moment I reached out to these people, there would be no turning back. Roderick would know someone had betrayed him, and he'd come after me with everything he had left. But what choice did I have? If I didn't act now, he'd win. He'd get away with everything. I spent the rest of the night making calls. Each conversation was short, careful, and to the point. Some of the people on the list refused to talk, their fear evident in their hurried excuses. Others listened, their voices tense as they agreed to meet in secret. By the time the sun started to rise, I had a handful of appointments set up. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first meeting took place in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. The man I was meeting, an accountant who used to handle Roderick's offshore accounts, arrived 15 minutes early. He sat at a corner booth, his back to the wall, his eyes darting nervously toward the door every few seconds. When I slid into the seat across from him, he flinched. You're the one who's been causing all this trouble, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Trouble's an understatement, I replied, folding my hands on the table. But you knew that when you agreed to meet me. He glanced around again, then leaned in closer. I don't have much time. If anyone finds out I'm talking to you. They won't, I said firmly. Just tell me what you know. For the next 10 minutes, he outlined transactions, shell companies, and accounts that led back to Roderick. It was the kind of information that would make any prosecutor's mouth water. But it also confirmed what I'd feared. Roderick had been laundering money for years, funneling it through networks so vast and complex that untangling them would be a monumental task. Still, I had something concrete now. Something I could use to build a case that wouldn't just tarnish Roderick's name, it would destroy him. When the accountant left, I stayed in the booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I stared out the window at the morning light filtering through the city streets. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't over yet. I still had a chance to bring him down. But I also knew that each step I took put me in greater danger. Roderick wasn't going to sit idly by while his empire crumbled. He would fight back. And if he couldn't find me, he'd go after the people I cared about. Celine's name flashed through my mind, and I pushed the thought aside. I couldn't afford distractions, not now. As the day wore on, I met with 2 more contacts from the list. Each one added another piece to the puzzle, filling in gaps I hadn't even known existed. By the time I returned to my apartment that evening, I had a folder full of new evidence, leads to follow, and a clearer picture of just how far Roderick's corruption went. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized just how dangerous this game had become. Benedict's warning played in my mind over and over. I could hear his voice, calm yet insistent, urging me to be careful, to think 3 steps ahead. I'd been so focused on the fight, so determined to expose the truth, that I hadn't stopped to consider what might happen once I did. But now, with Roderick's world on the verge of collapse, I knew there was no turning back. I was in this until the end. And I wasn't going down without a fight. You thought that was the end? Not even close. The truth is, the fight was just beginning. Stay tuned, because the twists you haven't seen yet will blow your mind. And let me know in the comments, did you see that coming? What would you have done? In the end, what I learned was simple: don't let anyone define your worth. You have to stand up for what's right, even when the odds feel impossible. The truth has a way of coming to light, but it takes courage and persistence to bring it there. If we all act with integrity, holding ourselves accountable, and refusing to be silenced by those who abuse power, our society can be stronger, fairer. Remember, the measure of a person isn't their bank account or their connections, it's their character. Stand firm. Fight for justice. That's how we change things.